my name is Peter Westerman, and this is Discussion Board Post 1 for the Old Testament Theology class with Professor Russ Meek. And this week we're talking about Esther. I guess the whole course we're talking about Esther, but specifically we're talking about how God's presence can be seen and known in the book of Esther, even though his name is never mentioned. I want to start off with a quote by John Piper. He wrote a poem in the 80s about Esther for his congregation, but he had an interesting quote in his book about it. He goes, "This book never mentions God, but he is everywhere, the invisible hand that moves empires for the sake of his people." And so the way that I like to set this up is it's through a comparison of two different things, and you can look at it and you can say this is either coincidence or confidence, and that confidence is in God. And it's true. The book of Esther never mentions God, yet when you read it, you can definitely see how it speaks to his confidence in God. And this can be seen in a few ways, but I think it's best to kind of go over a little bit about the story and to highlight some of the ways that God makes himself known through the story. So to start out, this book takes place after the Israelites had begun to move back to Jerusalem and back to Israel, back to the homeland from captivity in Babylon, but a couple of them stay, and they're not in Jerusalem, and this is called diaspora or something like that. And being an online student, pronunciation is a little tough, but they're outside of Jerusalem, these Jewish people, and Esther and her cousin Mordecai are among them, and they're being persecuted, and there's a lot of people that don't like them. They have a lot of enemies, and they're trying to kill them, and it's just not a good situation. And so it starts off there, and the king, the current king, doesn't like his wife because she doesn't listen to him like she wants him to, and so she is exiled. She's banished from the kingdom, and he needs a new king. So they bring in hundreds of women. Esther is one of them, and she gets chosen to become the new queen, and God's going to use her to then serve his purpose later, this big huge purpose. But there's a bunch of little things that go on that enable that. So next, not only is she chosen from these 100 women, which is a big deal, the king starts suffering from insomnia, which, I mean, I can't sleep sometimes, but he's having a really rough time. In order to put himself to sleep, he pulls out the history of his reign, because nothing is more soothing and sleep-inducing than reading about yourself. And so he goes back and starts reading, and he finds this record of Mordecai, Esther's cousin, who informed on this assassination plot against the king, and realized that Mordecai had never been rewarded for this. So in the middle of the night, he decides he wants to reward Mordecai, and he calls in Haman, one of his advisors, to figure out what they're going to do to honor this man that has served the king so fully. And Haman hates Mordecai because he's Jewish, and ends up devising this honor reward to give this man who he doesn't know who it is. He thinks it's himself. He comes up with this thing, and the king loves it and says, "Okay, now go do that for Mordecai." And now he's got to go do this awesome thing to this guy who he actually just wants to kill. And he's embarrassed and ashamed and everything. And then the king decides to have a banquet, right? Because that's what kings do. And Esther ends up, in that banquet time, reveals Haman's plot to kill her cousin Mordecai. The king leaves in anger because he's apparently that kind of guy, and whenever something bad happens, he just rages out and has to leave. And while he's gone, Haman throws himself at Esther's feet, pleading for her mercy and to convince the king not to kill him. But the king comes back and sees this and immediately says, "Execute him." He ends up being killed with the tool that he was going to use to kill Mordecai, this giant spike that he had in his backyard or something. And so all this ends up and leading to Mordecai being allowed to create a law on the king's authority. And this law, he writes, to allow the Jews to defend themselves against people that are trying to harm them, like Haman. And so there's all these enemies come, and they're all plotting to kill these Jewish people. But the Jews are not only able to defend themselves, but they find great and decisive victory against their enemies across all the provinces. So it's this huge climactic story that ends up with hundreds of lives being saved, thousands of lives being saved, thousands of Jewish lives being saved. And not only is this important for what we're seeing here in this book, but it relates to the entire Old Testament. And we can see a couple different things, but when Haman goes and he goes to talk to his wife about what happened, she warns him and she says, this guy Mordecai, he's a Jew, and you really shouldn't mess with him. And we can see that this culture recognizes that the Jews have a special God who is very powerful, and they recognize that. And it can relate back to Genesis 12:3. It says, I will bless those who bless you, and I'll curse those who curse you. All the peoples on earth will be blessed through you, which is a promise that God gave earlier. And that's being seen and acted here in in Esther with Mordecai, and the culture around him is recognizing that power as well. Not only that, but we see a kind of a synergy with Deuteronomy 4:27 through 31, where the Lord, it says, the Lord will scatter you among the peoples, diaspora, and only a few of you will survive among the nations to which the Lord will drive you. And talks about idols, but then it goes on to say, but if you seek me, if you seek the Lord your God, you will find him if you look for him with all your heart and with all your soul. When you are in distress and all these things have happened to you, then in later days you will return to the Lord your God and obey him, for the Lord your God is merciful. He will not abandon or destroy you or forget the covenant with your forefathers, which he confirmed to them by oath. So you see that promise being fulfilled here. And I know this is an Old Testament class, but one more verse that I thought was interesting actually comes from Paul in the New Testament when he's writing to the Ephesians. In chapter 1, verse 11, he says, in him we are also chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of him who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will. Works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will. So we see God's providence playing out in Esther. And Paul, strongly influenced, being a Jew himself, strongly influenced by these Old Testament scriptures, he is talking about the characteristics of God and the characteristics of his providence. And he knew about that, not just in his own life, but also in the knowledge of the scriptures. And Esther is a key component of that. And so it's hard to think that when Paul is describing this, describing a characteristic of God, that he wasn't heavily influenced by Esther. Now we can't know that, but I think there's a strong correlation there. And so anyway, those are my thoughts on God's providence and the evidence of his presence in Esther. I don't think the fact that his name isn't mentioned means that he's not there. We can see the way that his hand plays throughout the story to bring about some miraculous things, and things that, you could say it's a coincidence. I say it's a confidence. I say it's a confidence in God, a confidence in his presence and his providence in our lives. And that's the same way that he works in us today. We may scratch our heads and wonder why these miraculous, big, huge, wondrous things don't happen anymore. But they do. Sometimes God's very much in the forefront. Sometimes he's just in the background. And I think it's important for us to all stop and, recognize how God's working in your life, in the big ways, but also in the small ways. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this. I enjoyed doing this. It was a change of pace from all the other discussion board posts I've done online. So anyway, I look forward to your responses and also getting to hear from you guys. So